Story 1. I've been a nurse for more than 20 years now, and you'd think I'd have seen and heard it all by this point. But every once in a while, something happens that shakes you to your core, something you're not prepared for. You get patients who come and go. Sometimes they remember you, sometimes they don't. Some have no family, no visitors, just fading memories and faces you barely recognize anymore. Then there's Parker. Parker had been with us for a few months when he started talking more. At first, he kept to himself, just a quiet old man with sharp eyes that seemed too focused for his age. He wasn't the frail, forgetful type. He was strong once, still had the frame of it, though time had withered him like it does to all of us. One day, during our routine afternoon rounds, Parker asked if I could stay a bit longer after his checkup. He said he had a story to tell. "Nurse, do you believe in redemption?" he asked, voice low but steady. I wasn't sure how to answer, so I just nodded. Parker sighed deeply and leaned back in his chair. "You know," he began, staring out the window, "I haven't always been the man you see now." His voice carried an eerie calm, the kind that made you feel like something was about to be revealed, something dark. "When I was a boy, I lived with my mother and stepfather in a small town. My stepfather, he wasn't a kind man. He hurt us, hurt me and my mother, in ways I won't burden you with." His voice trembled just slightly, but he quickly regained composure. "I was 15 when I did it," Parker continued. "One day my stepfather came home drunk and angry like always, but this time it was worse. He was mad about something trivial, a plate not being clean enough, the floor not swept. He went after my mother and I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped. I pushed him." His hands, shaking slightly, folded on his lap. "We had this old well, deep and dark, out behind the house. The kind you couldn't see the bottom of no matter how hard you tried. When I pushed him, he stumbled back, his foot slipped, and he fell in. Just like that." Parker's face was pale now, his eyes distant, lost in that long-gone memory. I didn't even check if he was dead. I just stood there, listening to the sound of his body hitting the sides as he tumbled down. And then, nothing. Just silence. He let out a bitter chuckle. "I thought I'd saved us. I thought it was over." I listened in stunned silence. It wasn't the first time I'd heard stories of abusive households from my elderly patients. Trauma is a beast that follows people, even into old age. But Parker wasn't finished. "That was the first one," he whispered, almost to himself. "But it didn't stop there." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Parker's eyes met mine, sharp and calculating, as if weighing whether or not to tell me the rest. "There were more, over the years. A couple of boys from my school. Bullies. They tormented me for years, and one day I decided I'd had enough. I led them out to the well, told them it was a dare, something fun, and they, being the cruel idiots they were, thought it was a game. They leaned over the edge, laughing, daring each other to look inside, to see how far down it went." He paused, the memory clearly vivid in his mind. "And I pushed them too, just like I did my stepfather. They fell, screaming all the way down. And when they hit the bottom, the screams stopped." His eyes darkened, but then after a while, I started hearing them again. "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning in closer despite the growing sense of dread in my stomach. Parker's voice lowered to a near whisper. "I started hearing their screams. At night. Every night. It was like the well wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was something else, something alive. It wanted more. It needed more, and I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop myself." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe this was just the ramblings of an old man, maybe a mind unraveling with age. But the way he spoke, the way his hands trembled just slightly, told me this wasn't a story he'd invented. He believed every word. "They started coming back," he said, his voice shaking now. "I would hear them at night, scratching at the walls, screaming from the bottom of the well like they were still falling, forever falling." His eyes darted around the room as if he was trying to find an escape, as if the ghosts of his past were there with us. "I thought it was just my guilt," Parker said, his voice dropping lower. "But then they showed up. In my dreams at first, and then when I was awake. I'd see their faces. Twisted, decayed, like they'd been down there for years, but they hadn't aged a day, and they wanted me to come with them." "Did you ever tell anyone?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper now. caught in the terror of his confession. Parker laughed, a hollow, broken sound. Who would believe me? Who would believe a man who says the dead are coming for him? That a well is haunted by the souls of the people he threw down it? I didn't know what to say, and before I could think of something, he leaned closer. It's not just guilt, nurse, he said, his breath shallow. It's real. The well, it's alive. It's waiting for me, and I know it's coming soon. What's coming? I asked, the hair on my arm standing up. The thing that lives in the well, he whispered, his voice full of fear now. It's coming to take me. I've heard it, in the dark, every night getting closer. I can hear its footsteps, slow and heavy, and when it gets here, I know it'll drag me back to the well. I can't run from it anymore. Parker's body started to shake, and I instinctively reached out, trying to calm him down. It's okay, I said, even though I wasn't sure it was. You're safe here. But his eyes locked onto mine, wide with terror. No one is safe from it. Not me, not you. It doesn't stop, it doesn't rest. It will come, and when it does, I'll be gone, just like the others. The conversation left me unsettled for days. I wanted to believe it was just a story, just the delusions of an old man whose mind was slipping. But something in the way he spoke, in the fear that gripped him, made me think otherwise. Then, one night, Parker was gone. His bed was empty, the room was cold, the staff was baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that he'd left on his own. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. But I knew what had happened. That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I thought I heard something outside my window, a low, distant sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. A scream, and I swear, somewhere far away I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, moving closer. Story 2. It was 2013, a late October night when the air had that crisp bite of winter creeping in. I was on my way back from visiting my sister in West Virginia, driving through the mountains on a stretch of highway that was always eerily quiet at night. No streetlights, just the dark silhouette of trees and the distant hum of my car's engine. I've never been one to feel uneasy on the road. There's a kind of peace in the solitude, the rhythm of the drive. But that night, something was different. I'd been driving for maybe 2 hours when I noticed the brake lights of cars up ahead, a long line of them, stretching into the distance. Traffic at this time of night? In the middle of nowhere? It didn't make sense. There hadn't been any construction warnings, no detour signs. But there it was. An endless string of cars stopped on the highway, headlights illuminating the thick fog that had rolled in without warning. As I slowed to a stop behind an old pickup truck, I rolled down my window, trying to see what was going on. The fog was thick, almost unnaturally so, swirling in the beams of my headlights like it was alive. I could barely make out the car in front of me, let alone whatever was causing the backup. No one was honking, no one was yelling, just this dead silence, broken only by the occasional rumble of engines idling. I pulled out my phone to check for traffic updates, but there was no signal, no service at all. That wasn't unusual in the mountains, but it still made my stomach twist with unease. I turned off the engine and got out of the car, hoping to see more, but the moment I stepped out, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The air was thick, not just with fog, but with something heavier, something oppressive. I wasn't alone in feeling it. People in the cars ahead were getting out too, looking around, confused and wary. Then, without warning, I saw them. At first, it was just a few figures moving through the fog, coming from further up the road. Police, I thought. Maybe they were directing traffic or dealing with an accident. But as they got closer, I realized these weren't regular cops. They were wearing tactical gear, helmets with visors, carrying rifles. Their presence felt wrong, out of place in a situation that didn't seem to call for such heavy-handed measures. They moved with purpose, but also with a kind of urgency that made my heart race. One of them, a tall officer with a stern face, approached our group. "Get back in your vehicles," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Stay in your vehicles and keep the windows rolled up." "What's going on?" someone asked, but the officer didn't answer. He just repeated the command, more forcefully this time. "Stay in your vehicles. Do not get out for any reason." People began murmuring in confusion, but most followed orders, retreating back to their cars. I hesitated, still standing by my door, when I noticed more lights in the distance. They weren't headlights, They were floodlights, mounted on military-style vehicles moving slowly up the road toward us. Soldiers, actual soldiers in full tactical gear, were disembarking from the vehicles, setting up barricades and forming a perimeter around the line of cars. I felt my throat tighten. This wasn't normal. It wasn't an accident or a roadblock. Something was happening, something big, and none of us knew what it was. I quickly got back into my car, locking the doors and rolling up the windows as instructed. The driver in the pickup truck ahead of me did the same, glancing at me through his rearview mirror with the same anxious expression I was probably wearing. We were all waiting, unsure of what was happening, but trusting, hoping the authorities knew what they were doing. Then the first sound came. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the hum of engines and the distant shuffle of soldiers moving along the highway. A clicking sound like stones tapping together, echoing through the fog. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, the way sound does when there's nothing but emptiness around. At first, I thought it was the cars cooling down or maybe something caught under one of the vehicles, but the noise was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The clicking grew louder, closer. It wasn't just in one spot. It was coming from all directions, from the trees, from the sides of the road, from somewhere deep within the fog. I leaned forward, peering through my windshield, but I couldn't see anything past the thick veil of mist. Suddenly, a figure darted out of the fog on the far side of the road. It was fast, too fast for me to get a good look, just a blur of movement. But then I saw another and another. They moved in erratic, twitching bursts, like animals scurrying for cover, but there was something distinctly human about their shapes. The soldiers had noticed them too. Several of them raised their rifles, shouting commands that were swallowed up by the fog. The clicking grew louder, a cacophony now surrounding us. And then I saw them. They emerged from the fog like shadows, figures that weren't entirely human but weren't animals either. Their bodies were twisted, elongated, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin, as though they had been stretched beyond their natural limits. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed faintly in the dim light. But the sound they made, the clicking, it wasn't from their mouths. It came from somewhere deep within their bodies, a low guttural sound that reverberated through the air like the rattling of bones. Panic set in. I wasn't the only one. People in their cars began to honk, shout, roll down windows despite the warnings. I saw someone a few cars ahead get out and start running, screaming for help. One of the soldiers shouted for them to stop, but it was too late. The creatures moved fast, faster than any human could. They swarmed the man, their limbs twitching and bending in unnatural ways as they closed in. The fog obscured most of what happened next, but the sound was unmistakable, a scream, cut short by a horrible crunching noise that I could feel in my bones. I ducked down in my seat, heart racing, breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what they were doing. I just wanted to be anywhere but there. The soldiers opened fire. The night was filled with the staccato blasts of gunfire flashing through the fog like lightning. The creatures shrieked, a sound that was half human, half something else, something primal and monstrous, but they kept coming. For every one that fell, another appeared out of the mist, moving with that same erratic, unnatural speed. Suddenly, the radio in my car crackled to life. It wasn't music or a news report. It was a single voice, calm, almost soothing, but with an edge of urgency. "Stay in your vehicles," it said, the same command the officer had given us earlier. "Do not exit your vehicles under any circumstances." I could barely think. My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio dial, but I didn't turn it off. Somehow, that voice was the only thing keeping me grounded, reminding me that there were still people out there trying to help us, trying to keep us alive. The gunfire continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The clicking sounds gradually faded, replaced by the dull roar of silence. The fog didn't lift, but the shapes within it grew fewer and farther between until finally it seemed as if the creatures had retreated, disappearing back into whatever dark place they'd come from. The soldiers moved swiftly after that, gathering people from their cars, herding us into a nearby parking area off the highway. They didn't say much, just kept telling us to follow orders, to move quickly. No one asked questions. We were all too shaken to do anything but obey. As we gathered in the lot, I looked around at the other survivors. Some were bleeding, some in shock, but most just stood there silent like me. We all had the same haunted look, like we'd seen something we weren't supposed to. Something that didn't belong in this world. A man next to me, probably in his 40s, turned and muttered under his breath, "What the hell were those things?" No one answered. Hours passed before they let us go, but not before making us sign something, some kind of NDA threatening severe legal action if we ever spoke about what happened. They didn't give us a reason, just told us it was for national security. By that point, none of us had the energy to argue. When I finally got back to my car, I noticed the blood smeared on the driver's side door. Not mine. Someone else's. Maybe the man who'd been dragged into the fog. I wiped it away with trembling hands, but the stain remained in my mind. To this day, I still hear that clicking sound, sometimes at night, sometimes in my dreams. I can't drive through the mountains anymore, not without feeling that cold weight of dread settle in my chest. The government covered it up, just like they said they would, but those of us who were there, we know the truth. We know that something is still out there. Story 3. For as long as I can remember, I've had hallucinations. Not the fleeting kind where you see shadows in the corner of your eye or hear your name whispered in a crowd. No, my hallucinations were vivid, intrusive, and persistent. They started when I was a child, around the age of 7. At first, I thought they were imaginary friends, the kind of harmless fantasies that kids come up with to deal with being lonely. But they were far from friendly. There were 3 of them, always 3. They never changed, never left, and never allowed me a moment's peace. The first one was a woman named Claire. She was tall, with a long white dress, her hair hanging in thin, brittle strands over her face. Claire was calm, almost maternal in her demeanor, but there was something about her eyes, something vacant, as if she was only pretending to care. Then there was a boy, Thomas. He was no more than 10, with wide, glassy eyes and a frozen smile, always clutching a stuffed rabbit. He never spoke, just watched me, his gaze always heavy and unsettling. And then there was Albert. Albert was the worst. Albert was tall and gaunt, dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb all the light around him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, like something that had been buried too long and was slowly rotting away. But it was his face. His face was the thing that haunted me the most. His eyes were dark, sunken hollows, his lips too thin, stretched into a perpetual leering grin that never reached his eyes. He didn't appear as often as the others, but when he did, my world would turn cold. He never said much, but when he did, his words were like poison, filling me with dread. For years, I tried to convince myself they weren't real. My parents took me to therapists, doctors, psychiatrists, anyone who might have an explanation for what I was seeing. Diagnosis after diagnosis piled up: schizophrenia, psychotic depression, dissociative identity disorder, but nothing really fit. The medications dulled the edges of my hallucinations, but they never made them go away. By the time I was in my 20s, I'd learned to live with them. They were a part of my life, a shadow in the corner of every room, a whisper in every conversation. I learned to ignore them, or at least pretend to, but Albert was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. It wasn't until I met Rachel that things began to change. Rachel was my first serious girlfriend. We met at a coffee shop of all places and hit it off instantly. She had this way of making the world seem brighter, less terrifying. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could be normal. I didn't tell her about the hallucinations at first. How could I? I was terrified she'd leave, think I was crazy. But after a few months, I couldn't hide it anymore. They were becoming more frequent, more intense, especially Albert, I had to tell her. She took it better than I expected, honestly. She didn't run, didn't laugh. She just listened, and for a moment I thought maybe I could finally beat this. Maybe, with her help, I could make them go away for good. That was when I decided to go back on medication, this time with a determination I hadn't had before. My psychiatrist prescribed a new antipsychotic, something stronger, something that was supposed to quiet the voices, erase the visions, and for a while it worked. Claire faded first, then Thomas. Weeks passed, and I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from my chest. But Albert didn't fade. If anything, he got worse. The first time I saw him after starting the medication, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. I looked up into the mirror, and there he was, standing in the doorway, watching me with that sick, twisted grin. My heart jumped into my throat, and I froze, the toothbrush clattering into the sink. But when I spun around, the doorway was empty. I told myself it was just a glitch, my brain adjusting to the meds. But Albert wasn't a glitch. He started showing up more frequently, but not like before. Before, he had been confined to the corners of my mind, an unwelcome but familiar presence I could predict. Now, it was different. He was more vivid, more real. I would catch glimpses of him in reflections, at the edge of my vision. But when I turned, he was always gone. At first, I chalked it up to my brain fighting back against the medication, trying to cling to the delusion. That's what I told Rachel, and she believed me. She had to, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. Then the death started. It began with David, a friend from work. We weren't that close, but we hung out sometimes, grabbed a drink after shifts. One night, we were supposed to meet up at a bar downtown. I was running late, stuck in traffic, but when I finally arrived, David wasn't there. I called him, but there was no answer. Figuring he'd bailed, I went home. The next morning, I found out he was dead. They found him in his apartment, strangled to death, no signs of forced entry. The police called it a break-in gone wrong, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Albert had something to do with it. I hadn't seen Albert the night before, but I felt him. I always felt him, like a shadow lingering just out of reach. I tried to push the thought away, to tell myself that I was being paranoid, that my hallucinations couldn't hurt anyone but me. But then it happened again. Rachel's friend, Jessica, was next. She died in a car accident, a freak collision with a semi-truck that came out of nowhere. The timing was too close, too convenient. Two people, both connected to me, both dead within weeks of each other. And in the days leading up to each death, I had seen Albert. Not clearly, not directly, but always there, lingering in the periphery of my vision. I didn't tell Rachel. How could I? How do you tell someone that a hallucination, something that shouldn't exist, is killing people? She was already worried about me. She thought I was slipping again, that the medication wasn't working. And maybe she was right. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe this was all in my head. But then my mother disappeared. She had been staying with us for a few days, visiting from out of town. We were close, and I'd always been able to talk to her, even when the hallucinations got bad. She knew about them, of course, had known since I was a child. She never treated me like I was broken or dangerous, just different. The night she disappeared, I saw Albert. This time, he wasn't a flicker in the mirror or a shadow in the corner. He was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His grin was wider than ever, stretching across his pale face like something out of a nightmare. And in his hand, he held my mother's necklace, the one she always wore, a small silver locket. I jolted upright, the room spinning around me, and when I looked again, he was gone. I ran to the guest room where my mother had been staying, but the bed was empty. Her suitcase was still there, her clothes neatly folded on the chair, but she was gone. I searched the house, called her phone, but there was no answer. I woke Rachel, frantic, but she didn't understand. How could she? My mother had vanished, and I knew, deep down I knew, Albert had taken her. The police got involved, of course. They asked all the usual questions, searched the area, but there was no trace of her. No sign of a struggle, no forced entry. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. I could feel Albert everywhere, closing in, watching, waiting. I told Rachel everything, about David, Jessica, my mother. She tried to comfort me, told me it was just my mind playing tricks, that none of it was real. But I knew better. I started seeing him more clearly, not just in reflections or out of the corner of my eye. He would stand at the edge of my bed, his twisted grin wide, his hollow eyes fixed on me. Sometimes he would speak. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it was the kind of softness that made your skin crawl. "You're mine," he would whisper. "You've always been mine." I tried to fight it. I went to the psychiatrist, begged for stronger medication, anything to stop him, but nothing worked. The pills dulled the edges of the world, made everything blurry, but Albert was still there. He was always there. Rachel grew distant. She didn't say it, but I could tell she was scared of me. She started staying out late, making excuses, avoiding me. I didn't blame her. I was a mess, and she was caught in the middle of something she couldn't understand. Then one night, she didn't come home. I waited for hours, pacing the house, my mind racing. I tried calling her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Panic clawed at my chest, and I knew it was Albert. He had taken her just like the others. I could feel him, his presence thick in the air, suffocating me. I ran outside, desperate, not knowing where to go or what to do. And there, standing at the edge of the street, was Albert. He was holding something in his hand. Rachel's scarf. I collapsed, screaming her name into the empty night, but no one answered. Now I'm alone. Rachel never came back, and neither did my mother. The police have stopped calling, stopped asking questions. They think I'm crazy, and maybe they're right, but I know the truth. Albert is real. He always was, and he's coming for me next. I can feel him now, standing just behind me, his breath cold on my neck, his grin stretching wider and wider. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Maybe I don't want to.